Hello. You asked me before we started streaming podcast recommendations. I know that you have some money, so I won't tell you the cheap option, but you should use fireside.fm to host it, is what I would strongly recommend. And we use, if you want to do video, we use Restream.io for streaming and recording, and it's good for. It's a little pricey. I think StreamYard is equally fine.
What
If I
about
remember,
Riverside?
I haven't looked at that in a long time. I think over the past, I've looked at this stuff for the past couple of years, and they're kind of all at parity, sort of. I've heard a lot of people using Riverside, but I haven't looked at it. But what I would recommend looking for is one, it's not enterprise pricing. There's a couple of places I've looked at, and you like literally have to get on the phone with someone to like get a price. And like, being in the enterprise software sales world as we are, it's just like you get on the phone with them and you're like, oh god damn it, here we are. Just like I don't want to tell you what problem I'm looking to solve and what my goals are, and if there's a budget assigned for this, please don't qualify me. Anyways, so you don't want to use one of those where you have to qualify yourself. But I would look for that you can do up to like 1080p or whatever, right? Which it's just a mark of sophistication, I guess. Like if you can do that, then it's technically good.
So are you posting this that we're
Which
streaming?
just is. What's that?
Are we posting that we're streaming?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. And I'm doing that while I'm talking. That's why I'm talking weird. And then I would make sure you can stream to multiple places. And
I think to the point about parity, most of them are integrated to like 3 or 4 of the video platforms.
yeah. And yeah, like for example, I mean, it depends like what your marketing scheme is, so to speak. But like the one we use Restream, and it'll send to like Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and then there's all the other ones. Like all the services have all the other ones, and like I generally think I think that across all of them, I get the most interaction in Twitch, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Like Twitch is not like if you're doing actual like programming. I don't know. It's hard to tell. Like programming works well with Twitch because the mindset there is like, I mean, I think the mindset there is like you want to turn it on like you would turn on TV and just sort of have it on in the background. Like it's like leaving CNN or Fox or whatever just on all the time. And so like you want to find an activity that like you don't have to pay that close of attention to. That's why gaming works. And then programming is kind of like that because a lot of time in programming is just someone sitting there going like, "What? How do
I do this?
what is? Oh." And then there's also like interacting with chat people. Anyway, so but if you're just doing like more talking, I mean, Twitch can be fine. I don't know, but and then the other thing that I would look for, especially if you're going to do like a podcast version, is there's 2 more things. One, like we hold on, let me write this because I'll never write it out. What were we going to talk about? Do you have a Twitter handle for your new company?
The death of DevOps.
Yeah.
Ergonautically is the Twitter.
Ergonaut silly.
NAUTICLY.
Okay. And then the other thing you want to check for if you're doing a podcast, not that I would ever use this, but it's good to have, is that when you download the video, that you can download separate audio tracks, just in case you want to get crazy with it.
Well, the other benefit is the local recording, so you're not dependent on the internet connection of everyone.
Yeah. Wait, what were you saying? I was typing.
That you have the local recording for each of the
yes. So that's like I don't I never really like looked into that to know to recommend anything, but I think that is something that Riverside does in particular, and I'm not quite sure like what Restream and StreamYard do. We could ask Brandon, who actually like does all the editing.
Because
He
I
would know.
think the way Riverside, we've been looking into all this, right? That's why I asked this question. But I think Riverside has a local recording, but then they all get uploaded, and it can kind of like auto munge them for you before, or you can have them separate.
Yes, exactly, and that's what. So okay. There's two things there. One, with Restream, I don't know if it's recording locally. That's what I'm not sure about. But you can definitely download separate tracks for each participant. Like you can do that for sure. I guess you call that isolated. And depending on your setup, sometimes your headphones are so loud it bleeds into your mic or whatever. But you can use it. That's no problem. So then the final thing I would say is like, I mean, it is cool. Like you can see in our broadcast where you've got like templates and brand and all that stuff. Like that stuff is fun. So you can check that out. But like, I don't really care that much about it. Like it's not that big of a deal. But I think the other thing that's important is to figure out what the invitation system is. Like, I just sent you a link and you joined. Like, again, I think they're all at parity with this, but that's an important part. Having invitations that work. But I don't know. I hear good things about Riverside, but I've never checked it out. But definitely, if you're hosting a podcast, you should do it with Fireside. That's the best. And it's actually like written by a podcaster who's like a big time podcaster. So like all people who write software for the thing they love, it's very good. It does exactly what you would think. All right. Well, shall we formally get started then?
Do we do formal things? All right.
Well, it's just good to have a cutoff point for the podcast, because no one really wants. Only people who turn into our live streams want to hear my advice on streaming services. It's not a normal thing there, I guess, but that's fine. Plus, it's fun to have a reason to turn into streaming stuff. All right. Well, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, there's the short version and the long version. I'll try to give the meaningful bits.
Well, I don't have to make dinner for like 90 minutes, so.
I guess I did a few things. So a lot of people have knowledge of me or some of my ideas from the DevOps conversation, but my background really started as a software developer, got into the Agiles, hung out with Alistair Coburn and a bunch of these people and thought that was a good idea for a while. Then worked on Puppet and kind of like this foundational idea about moving system administration to look more like software development, going back to 2004. Then which is when I met you at Puppet, talking to Red Monk back in the day when that was the thing you did. Then got into a bunch of open source projects. So I was a VP of engineering for a OpenStack startup that was sold to EMC. That was an interesting chapter. Then spent 5 years running around at Pivotal doing the Cloud Foundry and Spring stuff. Then spent the last 3 years at Red Hat doing similar type of focus on their platform product. And then recently started a new thing with some of my friends that are, it's basically a continuation of all that same work, really focused on the sociotechnical system that you need to build to be successful, and doing it without needing to be beholden to any particular vendor or methodology or ideology. And I have my own ideas about a lot of this stuff, which hopefully we'll get to talk about a bit today. But that's where we're at right now, is just trying to help people do things better. We want people to have nice things.
And then, of course, your name is Andrew Clay Shafer.
Oh yeah, my name's Andrew Clay Shafer. Yeah, it's early.
It's easy to forget.
I'm on my first 160 milligrams of caffeine, which should hit right in the middle of this. And then my name's Andrew Clay Shafer. I did all the stuff I just said about the buzzwords, and we'll get into some of that. And then we started this new thing, and that has a fun name that I enjoyed like making up. We call it ergonautic, which is reference to Greek, and I'll let you read the blog post. You can see why I named it that.
And what was part of your criteria that names were available? Was that because I know that's a fun process.
So there's the name being available, and then there's names that are also it's related to like the way that legal things happen. So people can like trademark or copyright certain things, and so we did a little bit of a search for what we thought we could get away with, and that's what we ended up with.
So here's like listening to the your history there, and then what I know y'all are focusing on, like how would you describe the role that like you have been doing over the past few years, and then like that you're aspiring to do, right? Like would you call it a consultant or like an advisor? And when you do it at a vendor, you're obviously trying to be helpful, but you're trying to also like curry favor with the vendor that you have. And sometimes people will call this like a CTO role, which always like I never really like that phrase for it because I think whatever, or a field CTO. But what is that function? Like what does that type of job, that role do with people?
I think this is part of the kind of confusion of the state of the market as well. So going back, and you know how you got to where you are, the job you work in, because I helped get you there. So there's aspect of what we did that is related to marketing. Like it's just a blend and blur of things. So there's a consultative aspect. There's like a developer relations, or kind of like I would argue that some of the stuff that we did, particularly when we worked together, was kind of like operator relationships or stuff. And then more and more, especially with the current configuration, I think a lot of what we do is really focused on the C-level understanding and like setting up the rules of the game so that the rest of the practitioners can do the work. So from a practical business perspective, what we're setting up right now is a pure consultancy. And then what I did in the context of all those other roles with vendors, there was an affinity for the particular perspective of the market with the products and services involved. So and that informed a lot of the things that I think about right now, where there's almost too many products that people have bought and aren't very capable of using, and that's part of the problem that I want to help people solve.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, well, I'm always interested in this stuff, so I'll ask about it. But it almost seems like so there's this type of like working with people that's sort of like the how to work with executives, and like the it's all down to like almost the medium that you do it with, right? Like the first thing is always like, oh, you've got to be brief and never talk about the technologies, right? Like, just kind of be like, again, just be brief kind of in a memo form. And then there's another method that's sort of like, well, when you work with executives, you have to like, it's almost like be that counterintuitive person who tells them something is wrong that they didn't realize, right? And they're trying to like fix the way things are going. And then there's another one that, I mean, I don't know what all the categories are, but like it always seems like people portray like sitting down and working with an executive as like some strange mystic art, and like, but I don't know, like what are the different styles you find working with executives? Kind of like you were saying, like in the case of, I was told that the DevOps would fix everything, and now everything is not fixed. Like,
so this is a very fascinating topic. I think that similar to every other layer of this conversation, that for every piece of advice that you get, you can find a counter example or counter advice to that is going to play equally well. I think that as a category that executives aren't like a monolith than say developers or operators, and that you have to be able to understand the conversation and the way you're navigating it. And for me, there's lots of different ways to think about this, but here's a mental model I kind of have that might make sense to people or might not. But when I was in university, I spent a good fraction of the time on a debate scholarship,
Mm.
and so you go to these tournaments, and it doesn't matter who makes the best argument. It matters who the judges vote for, and so you have to profile the judges that you're going to, and so like certain arguments are not going to work with certain judges, and you kind of build a model in your head about what you can get away with, and then what will be received well. So like, for example, sometimes you have what we would call like the mom judges, where it's like someone that's not necessarily well versed in all these things, but they have like a perspective, and so you kind of try to appeal to whatever that perspective is, and then you're not going to use like really esoteric arguments, or like, in this case it would be like a technical detailed conversation. But then when you get to like someone who's at a school that practices like some of those esoteric arguments, then that you can run those and they'll respond to that. So similar to that, I think about like, who's this person, what's their background, how are they engaging me, what's the vocabulary they're choosing, and then based on the vocabulary that they're choosing and the way they're responding to the vocabulary I'm using, then like we started. It's like you negotiate the protocol that's going to work the best with that person. So I think right now you're actually seeing, and this is related to a bunch of these trends, you're seeing a shift in the market, in the leadership, where in a lot of cases, the CTO used to be an MBA, but where now you're seeing a CTO might actually have a technical background.
Mm.
Even in organizations that were, for a long time telling themselves they weren't technology companies, now they're making more and more kind of like shifts towards having that technical conversation at the highest level of the company, right? So if you have a C-level that has a technical background, then the conversations you can have are different than if you don't.
Yeah. I guess there's a great experiment going on now when you have a technical person become a CEO to see how that pans out for simple sharing services. But I mean, you're
This is a roller coaster ride, but if you look at the last decade of the market, that seems to work out pretty well.
Indeed. Yeah, and you're helping me like refine my question a little bit. Like one thing, and you're one of the people who do this a lot, and which is in order to kind of, and you do this with any person, right? But there's a certain subset of what do they call that when you're like modeling someone else's like posture and behavior and speaking pattern to like talk with them better. Maybe it's called modeling.
Mirroring.
Yeah, there you go. And like, you seem like one of these people who kind of like collects systems, like various systems and ways of thinking, so that when, there's lots of people who do this, so that when you go out, you can start to figure out like which system is useful for talking with someone. Like, whether it's like, systems of complexity or systems of that, or just kind of like, I always think of them as like models rather than systems. I don't know. There's probably not much different there, but you seem to have a pretty good catalog of like, it's almost as if you're going up to have a conversation with someone and you bring like this old laundry basket that's full of things, and you're like, how about this one? No? Okay. How about this one? And like you try to find the system or the model that matches so that you can just have the conversation.
Humans are deeply tribal, and the way that we kind of exchange information with each other, we're constantly tribal. We're signaling our tribe. So there's lots of tribal signaling. And then I won't go into the long version of this story, but I think I told you some of this over long dinners or something before. But like in some ways, I feel like I was never properly enculturated as a youth, and so then as a consequence of that, I just, as a survival mechanism, kind of got in the habit of like navigating and probing what tribe there is, and maybe I don't always show up as like a member of your tribe, but what's important is not that you think I'm always your tribe, that you don't think that I'm a tribe that's your enemy, right? So it's like finding ways
Sure.
to kind of like understand and like another way to talk about this is code switching
Yeah.
between the different perspectives and personas that you're interacting with.
Yeah. I mean, as a side note, it's interesting. It must be the case that people who like in the extreme ends of this, but people who were like kind of growing up nervous about fitting in, kind of like can develop all sorts of like what would you call it? Conniving is the wrong word. They can be clever about like trying to figure out how to fit into things, just like as you would need to. Well, so speaking of tribes, I think we have gone through the full cycle of people declaring that the something is dead, and that is DevOps. I feel like, you know, there's a bunch of, it'd be interesting to hear your history of like this phrase platform engineering. But I think maybe over almost a year now, this phrase has caught some currency. And then over the summer, it kind of like moved into like, I don't know, a new type of DevOps sort of thing or not. And then I think maybe it was 3 or 4 weeks ago. I think maybe right after you left Amsterdam, you were here for SREcon. There were a few things. I think you can tell when there's an apex of thought leadership when the new stack publishes some article that says X is dead, and then you've reached the height of it. And I think to his credit, I think what I saw was somewhere Jesse Robbins had a post of like, hey, that's kind of like shitting all over the people who worked on this. But, you know, so that's my funny little Coté cycle of something is dead. But, you know, what's your reflections on this idea of like platform engineering and how it fits in, or where it comes from, or what's going on with it?
Well, there's a few things to start with. If you're so inclined, and the internet doesn't necessarily forget these things, DevOps has died every year for a while now. So that's not like even interesting. I think it's sort of a kind of like a silly clickbaity way to position things. And then I also, I mean, and some of this we did together, and there's actually some podcasts that we made when we were working for the same company. I don't think anyone talked about platforms or platforming more than I have for the last 10 years. And I'll take that bet with anyone who wants to take it. So there's like, what is the actual utility of a certain idea, and then the buzzword, and then this kind of goes back to the question about how do you interact with the executives and the sponsorship. So when you think about this like cycle of buzzwords, I didn't necessarily like the word DevOps when people started using that. Maybe because I'm, you know, sardonic or what have you, and old, but it's like that's not. I mean, when we first started making some of these podcasts, I was calling this the agile infrastructure, right? So this is like way back. So it was like, why do we need a new word? Why do we need like a new thing? Oh, okay. Well, what I've come to realize over the last 20 years of watching these cycles is that the value of the new word, whether you're talking about the analysts or the executives or the practitioners, is it gives you a new thing to get funded, and it gives you a new thing to like try to clean up the thing that you did wrong the first time, right? So at this point we have, and I'm not exaggerating, you have organizations where there is a DevOps team, an SRE team, a DevSecOps team, continuous delivery team, you know, pick a buzzword, and they've got like these little pockets of you know, sponsorship and funding and headcount to do this work, and none of it's really working very well, and they're confused why, and adding a new buzzword and a new team is not going to fix that problem for you. And if you go back to what I consider like the principles of DevOps, then you need to build a platform that is fit for your purpose, and that platform should emerge from the the selfish interests involved across all these different capabilities in your organization that are negotiating with each other in favor of the collective. So the idea that all of a sudden you're going to get a much better outcome because you carved off some little special team to go work on tools that you're going to call your platform, like what was that DevOps team that you made supposedly doing? Like, what are the SRE teams that you made supposedly doing? You don't need a new thing. And I think so the person that started posting it is my coworker started posting in the stream, which is great. Another model that is interesting that is related to this kind of conversation is, I don't know if you saw the Cook talk on and he recently passed. So it was like there's all this conversation with AllSpa, the adaptive capacity stuff, and Dr. Cook gave this great talk on resilience, and particularly like using the bone in a living organism as a model of resilience. And in that model, what he talks about is, you can go watch it. It's a great talk. So there's like the redeploy version or the DevOps Day Chicago version or whatever. It's like 30-minute talk, and he models the bone and how bones break and how they're reformed and how they get build bone density along these like force lines. And the way that happens is you have these things called osteoblasts that build up bone and osteoclasts that tear down bone. And if you look at what we see in most of these organizations, you have this thing that's constantly adding, but you very rarely see people really revisit and tear things down. There's no resorption, right? So you just get like layer on layer on layer on layer. And if you do that in a living organism, that looks suspiciously like a tumor, right? So going back to the attention span of the executives, if you show up with something that sounds novel, relevant, and credible, they'll always listen to you. And if that is like of moving the ball forward and getting something funded and letting you do something that you couldn't do without that jargon, without that sponsorship, then I'm in favor of that. But if you think that just rubbing a new buzzword and like not changing anything, and particularly like not reconciling the holistic flow of work through these organizations, then it's not going to be better. Just adding a new silo into the problem that was like too many silos in the first place isn't going to solve your problem.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems like over the years, whether it's from around the agile infrastructure times, and thinking about that to through a little bit of web operations and then DevOps and SRE and the stuff, like organizations choose to like only do 40% of what was in the book, so to speak. and then they just kind of like coast through that.
Yeah, 40% is optimistic.
Well, I was going to start with 60%, and then I thought like that's too optimistic. But the point being that like, you could almost have like, if you were to make a visual and you kind of like listed whatever, just doing this for rhetorical purposes, whether it's whatever, but like you listed the practices and the things of each of these things, you could almost randomly pick through each phase which ones companies had adopted as a cluster. And there would be this weird, like, it'd be like those stock charts that have the error bars in them, sort of like going across the timeline.
You can open up organizations and you can almost tell what year they stopped learning or like what buzzwords were. But going back to the point you made, this article, which I try to read, not every single thing, but a lot of things. The article also declares the death of SRE, which is interesting, and reduces DevOps in that article to, if you build it, you run it, which is a much misunderstood and often quoted line from 2006 from Werner Vogel's Inside of Amazon, which is 3 years before DevOps is a word, and 2, when Werner Vogel says you build it, you run it, they already have API provisioning of infrastructure, API configuration, API, like everything looks like software development. And those platform APIs maybe not quite at a Heroku level, are already in place. So the two pizza team that you build it, you run it, is only running that very, very top layer, the cherry on top of the platform as a service, infrastructure as a service Sunday. They're not building infrastructure. You build it, you run it was never intended for developers to like build and run their own infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that point. I mean, I see that over and over again. It's the difference between like the stereotypical idea of a full stack developer that they're gonna go out and build all of the platform and
But
everything
the
underneath it.
pattern of this like clickbait strategy is like you just build up a straw man, and then you charge at the straw man, and then you defeat the straw man. It's like, okay, good job.
So what? Okay, so that makes sense. I mean, it's the is dead thing is a cherished cycle in our industry. I always wonder, like, I don't know why I always choose like cardboard manufacturing. I think it's because, I don't know if you still get these. Somehow you get on a list of like financial analysts, and then they send you like everything from that financial analyst house. And you're like, I had no idea there was a cardboard industry with the top 50 stocks that you might want to pay attention to. But I always think like I wonder like if in the cardboard industry are there as like strong debates ongoing in their trade magazines about practices like there's those 45-degree angle fold people, but it's really the 30-degree angle people who've got it going on. Their perforation is a little too wide.
I won't name the person who coined this term, but the narcissism of small differences is a very interesting little rabbit hole to go or read up on. That you have this sort of violent exchange between groups that from afar look nearly identical, right? And you could go through the whole conversation about what DevOps is or was to now, but it's like you're trying to solve the same problems. To me, I think it's absurd to think about any of these things separated from themselves, right? So it's like, can you do continuous delivery without DevOps? Microservices without DevOps? Like, good luck. You can't. Can you do microservices without a platform? Like, I literally been arguing that for going on almost 10 years, 8 years at least.
So this is a good point. Just define what a platform is. That's always fun to see done.
I mean, I think all these words, this kind of relate to some of the other themes you wanted to bring out later, but all these words have definitions that are not necessarily shared in the context of the conversation that you're having right now, right? So to me, if you believe there's such thing as a platform as a service, which we'll use the quote unquote as a service to mean it's somehow delivered through the internet with APIs, then that implies that there's some platformness that occurs without a service. So at the very, very simple level, I would argue that the platform is whatever accomplishes the kind of act of the work that's produced. These artifacts are produced, flowing from wherever they're produced, however they're produced, to production. And that could be a sysadmin running, doit5.sh, or that could be everything in between, right? So like we went through a few phases of this where we said, okay, like we're going to stop writing bash directly, and we're going to wrap our bash in Ruby and Python. And now it's like we're not going to write bash anymore. We're just going to put it in like these Docker files or in our Kubernetes YAML or whatever. So it's like still bash, it's still a bunch of janky bash. Like it's just what are we doing to kind of like wrap it up and hide it from ourselves?
To that point, like the thing I joke about this all the time, but like I'm always, I think way back when I got to know you and Luke at Puppet, and then later the chef people, I was always curious, like, yeah, but where's the code that actually like moves the bits from one directory to another one? Like eventually there's going to be some code that executes and does something, which I think is always easy to lose track of. I mean, especially like when over the years I've been learning what Kubernetes does, which I still only barely do. I always come across these things that are like, look how easy it is in 3 lines to deploy a cloud. And I always think like, yeah, but eventually there's some code that actually does something. And that's what I'd rather see than just,
Yeah, those 3 lines are sitting on a mountain of code that like someone else abstracted away from that, right?
yeah, I don't have the luxury or curse of doing this, but back when I was a programmer, one of my favorite things to do when I probably should have been doing actual work was just to like load up the Java program in a debugger and just like walk down the code to eventually find like, here's where the addition, not addition, not that level, but like here's where something actually happens. Because it like, and it, especially in like, man, it always feels like this with all the like infrastructure isn't object oriented. It's I don't. What word would you use to describe like the model that people think about infrastructure now? Like we used to call it like declarative or something, but like what word do people use for that type of design now?
So this is, I mean, this is a deep rabbit hole that can be go down. But the kind of tension going back to the Puppet days and now kind of being replayed in the YAML Kubernetes package operator wars is like, what does it mean to be imperative versus declarative?
Yes.
And the reality is, and Puppet always aspired to be declarative, right? Now, I would say if you look at kind of like the high level interesting bits of this, what these systems do is they set up a control loop where there's sort of like a sensor pass that tries to figure out what is the current state, compares that to the desired state, and then tries to reconcile that. So the declarative aspect is the desired state. Like we declare that we want these systems. And so if you think about what Puppet was trying to do, that was declarative in the context of a particular node. And then you get to Kubernetes where you get to be declarative in the context of more of a system, right? So like each node in the old style had to kind of be glued together. But the reality is that when you get to that reconciliation, that because of the nature of reality, time, and space, and the way that these systems actually work, that has to be imperative, right? So the declarative aspect of it is sort of like an abstracted fantasy, and there's a value to having that. But at the point where it doesn't work how you expected it to, then you have to go dig into those layers of abstraction that you put in between yourself and that reality and figure out what's going on to troubleshoot it. And so I'm not sure this is a very linear way to come back to this point, but one of the things that these are conversations that have been coming up for a while, but when you start to talk about infrastructure as code or any of these new things, now that you have this software that's doing these things, I don't understand why people didn't realize that that's now software and that you should engineer it like software. You should treat it like software. Right. That was like a major point of the conversation that I was having in the agile infrastructure days is like, you should treat this like software. You should have continuous integration on your infrastructure. You should have continuous integration on your platform as well as your software, right? And each of those might be separate. And what you're trying to do is keep them coherent and decoupled without delaminating from each other, right? Because I think that's where you get a lot of the interesting pathologies in organizations is that the platform is divergent from what the software and the software developers actually need it to be. And unless you have enabled them as agents to contribute to the barn raising of that platform, then like there's lots of different organizations with lots of different power dynamics, but in a lot of cases you see the developers running away from the platforms that were built, that weren't built by them for them.
Yeah, on that point, I forget if we talked about this when you were here, but I've been thinking a lot about the idea of part of what's good about, let's just say, platform, whatever we want to call it, like having a platform mindset of how you do things is you, by the nature, as you were kind of saying, by the nature of how you configure and package and run things. Like to some extent, it's literally programming when you're doing platform stuff, or it's like high level it's like the low code version of systems programming where you're programming a bunch of YAML files or whatever, right? Like you're doing a declarative thing, but it gets like so complicated that it might as well be programming the way that you're doing it. Like in the same way that like I have no idea what's happening at an operating system or a chip level, and I'm just kind of like typing in a bunch of stuff to like make some pixels move on a screen. Like similarly, you have that. So there's that programming going on. But what's interesting then is that, as you're saying, if you can get to the point where your developers, I guess, like send pull requests, like, you know, they can start submitting like patches and contributing back to the infrastructure, which is a very different, I mean, it's like a very DevOpsy way to think, right? That you would, you know, shift right, left, up and down, all the shifts. But like enabling that seems like a technological way to get collaboration going.
We'll call it a sociotechnical way. And without naming names, the most successful kind of platformy outcomes, in my opinion, come where that is the expression of the agency. That is the negotiation of the selfish interest in favor of the collective interest, when the platform itself can be run similar to like how you'd have an open source project in the wild, right? So you have the developers who have some understanding of these pipelines and the observability or whatever that is available to them, and they can. It's not that they have to, right? Because I think this is the argument that is, you don't want your developers to be burdened by this like operational consideration, but at the same time, if the platform's not fit for their purpose, what do you expect them to do? Right. And this is why you see this tension, or, you know, people call it shadow IT, whatever, between these central, these central kind of IT things versus the BUs who are like, yeah, we're not using that. We don't want to use your platform. We want to do this other thing. That doesn't always work out well either. That in a lot of cases, I think that there's been an over rotation onto like developer productivity, developer experience. And as a consequence, you're creating like this unbounded operational burden. Also, we haven't really talked about security, but unbounded attack surface as you allow each of those autonomous teams to have their choices. They're actually sacrificing the collective interest in favor of their selfish interest, where you can find that balance point in the middle where the platform makes the right thing, the easy thing, because every single developer at every single organization is constantly making a decision between doing things right and doing things right now. And they have all this other pressure on them to deliver, and, you know, with time pressure, whatever. So like the more that the platform can keep promises to enable those developers to focus on the domain logic for the thing they want to solve, without sacrificing the things that they, you know, don't necessarily want or don't necessarily do, but also don't sacrifice for the operational burden that you're creating. Don't sacrifice for the security or compliance or the rest of these other interests as well.
So here to go by another little rabbit hole here, just briefly, but I think it's important for a lot of what we were talking about here. So let's go back to the bones thing. And this is a rhetorical, a rhetoric question, which you know I love, as you do yourself. So how here let me put it this way: I struggle always with using metaphors too much to kind of convince someone how to think in a technical way, right? So let's take the bone one, right? So the bone one, you know, like you need to have, if you keep building on this. I'm going to mess up the actual thing because I haven't seen the talk. But if you keep piling on this like scar tissue or fixes or things, if you don't use a part of like a more natural system that might absorb it, then you're going to have elephantitis or something like that. Like something terrible is going to happen. And then like the thing I always struggle with is like trusting that rhetorical analogy, someone's going to be, and I'm going to make a joke of it to make a point, but someone's going to be like, we need to install Kubernetes. Right. And and so it's a matter of like how,
I mean, that's literally happening right now.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like, so that there's not so much a question here, to use that famous phrase, but like, you're one of the people who relies a lot more on like an analogistic jumps to other systems than I do. And like, how do you calibrate on how that works or not? Like, one of my favorite things is well, this one is a little bit better. Maybe this is part of the grading. Is like whatever the the rats on cocaine was. That was a great story in Minneapolis, and I remember that because I came across a reference to that study recently, and I remember, if I'm remembering it correctly, the great thing about the study, there's two ways you could interpret the study, and I think you'll probably remember better than I do. But the study was like, what will happen if we offer rats cocaine or food? What will they do? And like, they found out that in the first round, the rats will take the cocaine and like instead of the food. But then when I reread this or I came across this recently, what they said is, all right, so what if we give rats a really pleasant, enjoyable environment and everything is perfectly fine, versus one that's miserable? And the miserable ones would always go for the cocaine, whereas the happier ones would eat occasionally. And so like, so that's an analogy where you're like, oh, so we should make working here better. I mean, I'm
So I
grossly
think
simplifying.
the short and simple answer for me is, does it make sense to me and does it amuse me? My mental
That's
model.
good.
So like if I think there's something I can make sense of, then I'll try to help other people make sense of it. And so the example you're talking about, this is like fairly dated now, and there's a bunch of like back and forth about what any of this actually meant. But it's like this rat city experiment where they said, oh, if you make cocaine available to these rats, they'll all become drug addicts. But then that was, if you basically put rats in cages and like don't give them anything else to do, then they'll like keep taking cocaine or what have you. Or you could pick whatever addictive drug probably. But then what they demonstrated is, if like you create a nice environment for those rats to like express all these other healthy behaviors, then they'll choose to go like do that instead of like be drug addicts, right? And so that's like this thing about like just one is like inferring what something means without seeing a larger context is always problematic, right? And like that's
Yes.
part of related to like all these socio-technical systems problems that we're trying to solve, because I think there's a tendency um, for people to define the model at their convenience for the bias and the agenda that they have, right? So like you want to prove a certain thing, and you're going to see the data and interpret the narratives in such a way that the agenda that you already had in the first place is well served.
So okay. So then you've used this phrase several times. The what was it? The socio-technical
Social,
system.
yeah.
So what is that? Let's go over what that is.
Well, if you're reading a lot of the kind of like whatever propaganda people are trying to spin up around platform, they started using social technical quite a bit, and a lot of them are misusing it, which isn't surprising because words are hard or whatever. But if you go back in time and look at how that word comes into the lexicon, is actually started in it was studying coal miners in London. So there's this Tavistock Institute and this guy Trist, and they write all these papers. And one of the things I did in the last couple of months is I read a bunch of the social technical systems papers, which is like interesting in my brain, but maybe not for everyone. So the story is, and again, shocking plot twist, that they have invested in all of this automation, this machinery to do coal mining, and yet they're not getting a good return on that investment. In fact, productivity is flat or declined, morale is down, and safety is down in these coal mines that have tried to adopt all of this centralized planning for the automation for the coal mines. And so what Trist shows is that if you give the local team with the understanding of that particular vein and the flow of the coal that they need or can produce, that they have better morale, that they have higher productivity, and they have better safety. Right? And this goes back to like the 1950s. And then here's where the story kind of gets sad to me, is that over and over, and you can kind of go up through like the rest of these narratives, like Akoff, Deming, like all this other stuff, right? So like in the DevOps conversation, we got all this Deming stuff at different times in the conversation, and it's like that stuff's all old. Like, why did we, or the organizational learning stuff too? That's from the 90s. Why is it like buried under all these layers 20 years later that we're kind of like uncovering it? And so what happens in the coal mining is that the Tavistock Institute and TRISP write all these papers about how these kind of like self-organizing autonomous teams have higher productivity and better safety and better morale and all these other things. And then that goes back to the managers, and they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. No way. We're not going to do that. And then over time, they start to demonstrate like such better metrics that there starts to be some investment in trying to have those teams be managed that way, because the managers, they're just afraid of like they won't have anything to manage, I guess. And then what ends up happening, this sad story, is the oil industry starts to overtake the dynamic of the energy industry and like how we are consuming these different sources of hydrocarbons, which has ramifications for us now. Basically, like all that stuff kind of gets like lost and buried because everyone's like, oh, that's for coal mining. Now that's like we're doing oil, and like it just goes right back to like autocrats and command and control because it's on a new curve. So
it's like a double eye rolly, like not only in the coal industry where people like, no, we're not doing that, but then you go to a whole new industry and it's like, oh no, we're special. That's for oil. It's a completely different system. We wouldn't learn from that.
Yeah, but the theme over and over is that these investments in automation that end up dehumanizing that kind of social side of the decision making are not leading to higher productivity, even though in theory they should. And that you don't get that higher productivity until you enable those agents that have an understanding and a context that those central planners don't have to be able to direct those resources appropriately.
Right. Yeah, so that's a great example from my weird analogy, using analogy questions, right? Because you got two things going on there. One, it's just like here's how groups of people work when they're solving problems, right? And like it's kind of studied, and also we've seen it over like one of the when Willis tells his Deming story. There's a similar thing where he's like, oh, all the men went off for World War II, and then women and other people ran the factories, and it went pretty well. And then the men came back and they're like, we got it, see you later, and just sort of went back to the way things are going.
Even J.W. Willis is like, like I brought a lot of the Deming stuff into the DevOps conversation, and this is like the same exact pattern where Deming demonstrates these improvements in productivity in American factories, and then when people come back from the war, they're like, no, that's for women.
Exactly. And then the second part of why this kind of story, I'm again thinking,
like one quick thing is like, then Deming goes to Japan and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. And then they crush the US. And in fact, there's a Deming Prize in Japan to this day in honor of like the ideas. And that's really where all the lean stuff comes from ultimately as well.
Maybe in the future you can turn into our special Software Defined Talk book club episode with John Willis. When I read his
he's publishing a book. I think it should come out early next year.
Indeed. And so then the second part of why I think the coal mining thing is good for all the way back to talking with IT executives, right? Is there's a good shift in there where it's like, and like there's not really anything particularly special about how you run IT. Just like there wasn't anything special between like coal mining and like oil mining. Sure, technology might be different and the way you go about doing things might be different, but the way that people like work on problems is the same. So therefore, we can look at all of these studies that don't involve like computers and like learn some organizational behaviors from them, which when I listen to myself saying it out loud sounds like stupidly obvious. But like we've all been around long enough to know that like it's almost like the more specialized your technical skills are, or just your skills, the more specialized your skills are, the more you tend to think that the way other people operate doesn't apply to you. That like there's something special about how you're operating, and like you've got to like reinvent things, or like it's not going to work well for you. Like it just doesn't apply.
I think it goes back a little bit to the point I was making about tribalism, but then it also goes to the, like, we all make locally rational decisions, right? Because we don't have the greater context. And so we're going to optimize for the things that we experience and the things that we see. And in fact, this is where it gets really hard, is that the only way to really act is locally. You can't take global actions except through the agency of the local actors. So this is why these problems are difficult. They have all the kind of like unpredictability and complexity of any agent-based system, but you also have a little bit of a danger here, because this kind of goes back to your critique of metaphor, that I do think there are some qualitative differences when you start talking about the flow of knowledge work through a system where the output is actually variation. You're creating variation that is different than the manufacturing or the coal mining metaphor, where what you're trying to produce or extract is the minimization of the variation, right? Because you're
Right.
make the exact same thing all the time. So the types of processes that you can bring, or the type of optimizations that you can bring to that kind of process where you're minimizing the variation, is slightly different, qualitatively different than what is optimal for knowledge work.
I guess that makes sense. I mean, it's kind of like the old you had a good quip way back when about, it's good to do waterfall development if you know exactly what you want to do, and it doesn't
Waterfall
change.
is optimal if there is no uncertainty in the system.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I mean, I like that distinction of like, there's probably multiple types of work or whatever, but one of them, as you say, is that you want this same result with little variation in how it's achieved. I mean, especially when it comes to like coal mining and oil, you don't want to like be reinventing it every time. And once you figure out the right way to do it, it's safe to do it that way, versus like, I guess, I don't know, creative seems like whatever, but whenever you're trying to like innovate something, you're almost trying to, how can we maximize the benefits of chaos and evolution and somehow like protect ourselves from like, oh, we screwed up big time there. And so therefore, I don't know, they're
another fun rabbit hole is innovation, right? So it's like you have these organizations and they say we want innovation, and it's like, okay, well, what do you actually want? What do you actually need? And one is like, you don't really need innovation, first of all. But second of all, you say you want innovation, but then you also want it to be like this completely like spelled out mathematical return on investment for the money that you're going to put into it, right? If you're not, this is where I think a lot of these enterprises and leaders fall down, because they want certainty, and they'll sacrifice everything for the illusion of certainty. And they're like, they want the business case for why this innovation is going to return the investment. And if you look at the way that these models work, whether you're talking about Silicon Valley or Bell Labs or Xerox or whatever, like you have to allow that variation to explore the parameter space to really get innovation to happen. But furthermore, especially when you start talking about like these digital experiences and what people need, for the most part, what people actually need is not innovation. What they need is the most obvious solution applied to their most obvious problem, which in almost all cases is that you have a bunch of data, and that data needs to be analyzed in such a way and presented in such a way to the right people at the right time so that they can make a better decision or make a better action. right? So most of what people are calling like innovation in startup land, it's not technical innovation. It's like there's a database and there's a user interface and it
Right.
like connects the cars or it connects the movies or it connects the food. It's like it's not technical innovation at all. It's like relatively well-defined, well-studied, well-solved problems applied to a new domain. So the innovation might be that you applied it to this like slight variation of domain, not anything to do with technology.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, that is a that would be fun to have a system that like kind of helps you figure out innovation versus doing the obvious, or more nuanced, figuring out why you can't do the obvious, right? Like, you know, in the old thing of like, we used a really simple example of like, well, of course, we should have a way that you can order food online. Like, it's not like an innovative idea to do that, but for some reason we don't do that. Or like, you know, of course, my favorite example is historically, like I used to, until very recently, I had to pay my life insurance by filling out a PDF every year and doing something absurd. And it's like, you know, it's innovative in a way that now I don't. But really, like, what was probably innovative in that like local environment was like innovating how we can just do that work. Like, why haven't we done it? And now we've got to come up with like setting up the system such that we can do it. Which I don't know if that's budget or whatever, but like there's I guess we used to call that like incremental improvement versus big bang innovation or something.
I mean, again, not to like blame the guilty or get too deep into any specific example, but it kind of goes back to the bone example, right? So you use this word work, and that's like basis of the name of the company that I'm starting. So work is many things. It is the process and is also the output. And in a lot of cases, what happens in organizations, it starts early, but especially these like long-standing enterprises, that the work itself and the people that do the work are attached to the work and the way that it's done, such that their identity is the work. So when you say we're going to change how we do this, there's a whole bunch of people that take the paper form that you're filling out for your insurance, and that's their job. And they're gonna preserve their chance to do that work. They will fight you. So those silos become sort of self-perpetuating, because now that you made it someone's job, they don't want to do it. And so the reason I say this ties back to the bone thing is that kind of you need to like resorb the people that are taking the paper in order to get to the point where you don't need to take the paper.
Right. That sounds like some kung fu training. Get to the point where you don't need to take the paper.
We should talk a little bit about SRE. SRE.
That's where we how long, this was like 3 weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you came and gave a keynote at SREcon. I can't find the recording, but you told me a little bit about it.
I got posted. I posted my.
Oh, okay. Well,
I know it will be.
Oh, of course, but not at the moment is what I mean. But so what were you giving a talk about there? What were you speaking on?
Well, like most of my talks, it was a rambling, meandering like list of half made points. But
well, if someone's listened to this far to the podcast, they clearly enjoy that format.
Yeah. So the title of the talk was SRE as She Has Spoke, which is a reference to a book that was written called English as She Has Spoke, which is, if you look it up on Wikipedia, a book that was in theory about translating from Portuguese into English, but the thing is very comical because the person who wrote it clearly didn't understand English, and then you can go like read the whole story. But supposedly this was amusing like Abraham Lincoln and Mark Twain and all these people of the time in the kind of like 1800s.
I love imagining like sharing memes in the 1800s, like what that must have been over the course of months.
So the reason this is interesting and kind of like connected to a lot of the themes about the language that we use for whether you're talking about SRE, DevOps, platform engineering, whatever, is that a lot of times that you have books that are written by people who don't understand the topic that they're writing the book about. So that's one of the main themes. And then like there's all these other models I have in my head about fluency and like language acquisition as a model for skills acquisition in general. And there's some research and some interesting things about how people learn languages and what you can do. But the research and these language learning communities have demonstrated that you can become fluent in a language in 6 months if you create certain preconditions to acquire that skill. Uh, and I think most organizations don't don't create the preconditions for their people to learn the skills that they need, and they're constantly caught in this. Um, we'll use the mouse on the wheel thing. They're like they're trying to find the right people, and they're like constantly lamenting that they don't have the right talent when they don't do the right thing to develop the talent that they already have in their building.
Yeah, I mean that connects to one of your, from several years ago, famous things of there is no talent shortage. Kind of a way of the way I always thought about it. I'll summarize your talk for you, Andrew. The way I always think about it is exactly what you're just saying. Is like, well, have you tried to like build a system where people you have or hire can do their job, or you can train them and you can like they can learn, right? And I mean back to the thing of like how far you can go with an analogy, right? Like it's another good application, as you were just going over, to say, well, the science or whatever, the pedagogy of learning languages is very well studied and understood, which is just like skills acquisition, sort of. So, you can follow that thinking, or all these other ways of like doing skill stuff versus like there's nothing special about IT stuff such that like people can't just learn how to do it if you give them that setup. Like you don't, it's
you learn the best by doing it, right? And so that's what like I think a lot of organizations get trapped in this mode where, oh, we got to train people. You need to set up the systems of work in such a way that you get better at doing the work by doing the work. And that's also key to language acquisition. You
yeah.
acquire language by using the language.
Well, speaking of using the language, I've got to go use some language with the pans to make dinner. I don't know what that language is because I'm often very quiet.
We have lots of cooking metaphors we could break out now too.
That's the one over the years I always fall into, is just food. That's where my mind always is, unfortunately. Well, great. It's been fun catching up and talking. Where do you want to send people to? What if they're interested in more?
Always a pleasure, and thanks for having me. Little Idea on Twitter is a good one, assuming Twitter keeps staying Twitter. Andrew Clay Shafer on LinkedIn is also good, and then our new story is ergonautic.ly, which we can probably put in the show notes.
And I don't know if you still do, but as you used to say, engage with my brand.
Engage with my brand. Yeah.
All right.
I'm a social media expert.
Well, I'll put links to that in the show notes. So if you go to softwaredefinedtalk.com, I don't think this will be an episode number, but just go to softwaredefinedtalk.com and you can find this episode and find the links there. And with that, we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.
Stay high, stay safe. Cheers.
All right, now I'm still streaming, but that's the end of the podcast. You see how it goes? It's just a little like behind the scenes stuff. I was doing this with someone yesterday and they didn't realize we were still streaming, so I had to go and edit something. But that's fine. Luckily, it was like at the end, so I could just trim off the end of it.
You're still on stage. Your mic is hot.
Exactly. All right.
I can hear the natives are getting restless.
Indeed, they're actually being very calm, so that's nice.
Where are we going to feed them?
I have no idea. That's part of the adventure of just kind of figuring out what's in there.
I'm 3 weeks out. We're getting down to the last of the Gouda that I brought home, and we destroyed the stroopwafels like in short order.
Yes. Yeah. How many? You're probably better. How much weight would you say that Howdah was?
The one you gave us?
Yeah.
Because I bought a bunch more on the way
okay.
home.
So you've eaten a lot more then. That's good.
So I think yours was half a kilo.
I guess that sounds right. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I think I brought home another five. No, not quite five. Probably like 4 kilos
Yeah.
of Gouda.
Well, next time that I miss some Southwestern or Tex-Mex food, I'll just think like, yeah, but I can have all the Dutch cheese that I want.
Yeah. My 10-year-old, this he is like he would eat a stroopwafel for every meal forever, I think, right now. So
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. We gave you I got you like the big ones, right? Not like the miniature ones. The
yeah.
miniature ones are fine because you can they're just like little snack bowl
I
items.
got the multi-flavored Gouda and stroopwafel deal at the way out. Yeah.
Very nice. All right.
So
All
yeah,
right.
fancy stroopwafel flavors.
All right. Well, I'm going to end this stream. Thanks for everyone for watching. It was fun to see your comments. As always, I publish these as a podcast, so I don't really acknowledge the chat very much, but it was nice to see people talking. And I'll see.
I'm going to argue tacos are better than Dutch cheese, though.
Absolutely. You know why? Because you can put cheese in a taco, but you can't put a taco in cheese.
But
So
you tell yourself what you got to do to get through the experience.